Alrighty, but hopefully we're happy with this question. If you have any questions, obviously, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to our cumulative frequency and ogives. So as we get started, can anyone tell me, actually, I'll wait for a second in case you want to screenshot. But my question is going to be, can you tell me what is cumulative frequency and how it relates to ogives? So you can put an answer on the chat. You can unmute yourself in a second or two. I'm going to move away from this now. But my question is basically, what is cumulative frequency? And I put a little addition to how does it relate or correspond with an ogive. Okay, so I'll give you a second to think about it. What is it? Can anyone tell me how you calculate or determine cumulative frequencies? Maybe let's start with something a little bit easier. Okay, it's clearly been a while. Okay, so guys, cumulative frequency is basically the addition of your frequency. You're going to see this now in a second how we calculate it. But basically, as you have frequencies for different intervals, as you start to add up interval 1 plus 2, interval 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, what you're getting is your cumulative frequency. And basically what it allows us to do is it allows us to then determine how many people, how many things in values are within a certain range or below a certain value or whatever the case is. And you'll see in an example what I mean by that now. The cumulative frequency allows us to answer questions like, how many people got a mark above 70%? What percentage of people got a test score below 75%? It allows us to work with those sorts of questions. Right, an ogive is basically the graph of your cumulative frequency. Sometimes we call it a cumulative frequency graph. It's very long stuff to write down. But basically, it's almost like an S-shaped graph. It doesn't always turn out that way. That's a terrible graph. Let's try that again. It's something like that, and you can then go and look at your cumulative frequency in relation to the intervals of data that you are working with. So that is what your cumulative frequency is, what an ogive is, and we're going to have a look at an example to just sort of understand what all of that means. Let's see if this makes this too small. Okay, so let's do that so we can see everything on the same page. Okay, cool. So in this example, we're not actually going to do a whole lot here because there's no questions. This is more, sorry, I know I'm blocking this table a lot. This is more just to explain what is a cumulative frequency table, what is an ogive, and then we'll get into some actual calculation examples. So we've got a health company conducted a survey in Gauteng to find out which age group most frequently used their products. So what we will need to realize is that in order for us to get an ogive, we need to take information from a frequency table and thus using the cumulative frequency in order to get an ogive. Some people say ogives, but I say ogive. If you say ogive, that's fine. Whatever. All right, so the parts of the table that you should be familiar with already, so things that you should have already seen at some point, are class intervals, frequency, and probably that's about it. If you've already done stats, you probably will have seen the cumulative frequency, but I'm going to look at the first two just to start off with. Okay, so in our first column, the class interval column, what we have going on here is basically groups. So these class intervals, are groupings of our data. So what we've essentially gone and said is, okay, cool, we've got all this data and I'm going to put it into groups of 10 values. As you can see, the first interval is from 0 to 10, then from 10 to 20, 20 to 30, etc., etc., etc. It's very important to take note of what values are included. And to do that, remember, we look at the inequality sign. So for example, in that second interval there, it's from 10 up to and including 20. So it'd be 11, 12, 13, 14, obviously depending on what it is we're talking about. We're talking about number of people, so we can only have discrete values. Okay, so we've got our intervals. They give us the groups in which our data has been grouped, and then we have the frequency. The frequency tells us how many data points fall in that interval. So as you can see, maybe not super explicit, so let's actually just write this down. This value of 11 that we have here means that 11 people, it's not going to work very well. 11 people, sorry, just my brain, were between the ages of 10 and 20. If you wanted to be a little bit more specific based on the interval, 11 and 20. That is what the frequency tells us. If we look at the next frequency, 14 people were between the ages of 21 and 30. 17 people between the ages of 31 and 40, etc., etc., etc. So the frequency tells us how many we have in each interval. Now, unfortunately, what that means is we don't know the specific data point. I don't know the specific ages of these 11 people between 10 and 20. I just know that there's 11 of them between 10 and 20. So that's going to come up a little bit later, but just bear in mind, you don't know the exact data points, but you know there's 11 of them that fall somewhere in that range. Okay, so this is what you should have been used to pretty much since like grade 9. You did a lot of this work on stats in grade 10 and grade 11 with frequency tables. What is now new to us is this idea of cumulative frequency. Now, some of you might have done this already in grade 11. Most of you would have, because cumulative frequency in ogives is a grade 11 concept. But this is where we now need to be able to work with cumulative frequency to get our ogive. Okay, so cumulative frequency is basically the successive addition of your frequency values. And I'll explain what I mean by that now. Now, if you think about what cumulative means, it sounds like accumulation. So we are getting more and more of our frequency values that we're adding together to get the cumulative frequency. Okay, so cumulative frequency would basically be as follows. We would start with the first value. This first interval is actually a bit of a non-entity, and obviously nothing really happened there. So let's try that again. So this first interval, I can sort of ignore because of the, because of the fact that there's actually nothing there. I can't tell you why this is disappearing right now. Wish I could, there we go. Because there's nothing in that interval, it's not useful to me. So our data actually starts between 10 and 20. Cumulative frequency basically takes the first frequency value of 11 and it successively adds the next ones. So to get the next cumulative frequency value, we would now take 11 plus 14, which is what I've got here, to get 25. Then I would take the next frequency value, which is 17, and I will add that to my 25. So 25 plus 17, 42. And I keep adding on my frequencies, stupid thing. Keep adding on my frequencies basically until I have totaled up all of my frequency values. Now, what's quite nice is that the final cumulative frequency that you get is actually the total number of data points, or the total for your frequency in your table. And so what it is essentially doing is it's adding up all of your frequencies to allow you to work out different things, which I'm going to get to now, but essentially taking into account all of the data points that you have. Okay, so if we pick a random cumulative frequency, let's say, for example, we pick this one, 68. So this cumulative frequency of 68. This is basically the addition of all of the cumulative frequencies for the intervals 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, etc., up to 60 to 70. That is the addition of all of those frequencies. And so what that means is that 68 people were 70 years old or less. Why? Because 70 is the upper limit of the last interval I added. And that 68 includes all of these frequencies from all of my previous intervals. So it's telling me that 68 people were less than 70 years old, including 70, but basically less than. And that's what cumulative frequency is useful for. It allows us to determine and to work with such questions. So I could ask you, how many people were 70 years old or less? And you could use your cumulative frequency to go and determine that value. So cumulative frequency is just the constant addition of your frequency values, and it allows us to determine how many people were above or below a certain age. Right, so once we have our cumulative frequency, basically what we're able to do is we are able to go and draw a cumulative frequency graph, or what we call an ogive. I never call it a cumulative frequency graph. Sometimes they do in past papers. Often they'll say, use the data to draw a cumulative frequency graph, and then they put in brackets ogive. Just know it's the same thing. Oh, excuse me. So what we now need to do is we need to take the information of our intervals, and we need to take the cumulative frequency information, and we need to draw a graph. Now, in order for us to draw a graph, we obviously need to understand what points it is that we are going to go and plot. And this is where this last column is quite useful, our graph points. Now, when you are going to graph your cumulative frequency, you always take the upper limit of your intervals. So the 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Those will be all of your x values. So if you go to the graph points, those correspond directly with all of your x values. The reason for that, guys, is just think about what cumulative frequency is. Remember, it's adding up until the end of an interval, up until the end of the next interval, end of the next interval. So we're going to use all of those endpoints because that corresponds with what a cumulative frequency is. Because of the fact that cumulative frequency is up to the endpoint of each interval, we then take those endpoints and plot them alongside those cumulative frequency values. So these y values that we have here are all of the cumulative frequency values we got as we added throughout our table. Okay, it's tedious work, but anywho. Woo. So when you are plotting your ogive, it is the end point of each interval and its cumulative frequency. And you can see that on your ogive now. If, say, for example, we look at a random point, it doesn't really matter which point we choose. Let's take the 62, 60. There it is. It's plotted on your ogive at 60, 62. In terms of where your ogive starts, it'll change depending on your data, but your starting point for your ogive is the lower interval of your first, or the lower end of your first interval. So this is our lower end of our first interval, and we ground it at the 0. So as you can see here, this last point is at 10, 0. We take the lower limit of our first interval and we ground it or plot it at 0 on the y-axis. That is always the case. So your ogive should never just almost start randomly within your Cartesian plane. It should always be grounded on the x-axis, and it's at the value of the lower limit of your first interval. Right, and then basically if you're drawing an ogive, once you have your cumulative frequency and obviously you're given the endpoints, you take those two bits of information, you plot it, and you form this sort of S-shaped graph. This, obviously the shape very much depends on your information. But it has a curve. You should not be joining it with a ruler. It is a curved graph, and it is plotting your cumulative frequency. Okay, so if we go back to that little point that we had earlier where I said that if we pick this random value of 68, it's saying 68 people were age 70 or less. If we go to that cumulative frequency, or if we go to that limit of 70, I'm going to do my best to draw this. Let's actually maybe make this a bit bigger so we can see. I will make it smaller again in a second. So if we go to 70, my numbers are off, but anyway, we can see that that corresponds with 68. So if we were now to drop a horizontal down, it's not going to be perfect, but we're just going to work with it. Okay, it's sort of a horizontal all the way down. What that's basically saying to us is that everything below is 70 or below. Everything above is above 70 years old. So having our cumulative frequencies essentially allows us to break up our graph into different sections. People who are below this age, people who are above this age, people who got below a certain mark, people who got above a certain mark. And that's essentially why an ogive cumulative frequency graph is so useful, because we can start to see, okay, well, if my cumulative frequency in this case was 68, we're basically saying 68 out of 77 are 70 or younger. We can work that out as a percentage. We can now start drawing other graphs based on that, like pie charts and bar graphs. It allows us to do some sort of interpretation on our information. And so that's why these graphs are so useful, but obviously you need to be able to go find cumulative frequencies, draw them, and then perform those sort of interpretations on it. Okay, so I'm going to let you take a screenshot of this. Just take off these beautiful scribbles. If you've got questions, guys, obviously remember, please ask. Let's take a screenshot and then let's look at an actual example where we're doing stuff. Again, just ask as we go along if you have any questions. Okay, so if we have a look at our first, say first, because this is the first one, we're actually going to do some calculations. We have been told that the table below shows the marks obtained by 220 learners in a mathematics exam. And what I want you guys to notice is that the intervals given in my table, so the intervals here for my x, are the same intervals that I have down in my cumulative frequency or my frequency table. I know it's a lot of scribbles, but I'm just trying to show you that they match up. Okay, so the first question is asking us to complete the cumulative frequency column for the data. Now, guys, we don't have the frequency, but it's very easy. We just go and fill in this information. So there are 2 people between 1 and 10. There are 6 people between 11 and 20, and so we can just fill in our frequency. Now, remember, we need our frequency because this is going to help us work out our cumulative frequency. 45, 20, 11, 5. Okay. Now, you can go and double check that those numbers add up to 220. Why 220? Well, because we were told 220 learners. It should always correspond with, or the total should always be the total number of data points that you have. So our total here would be 220. Right, the important bit though is that we've been asked to fill in the Q. Yeah, sorry.
Ma'am, so with the table above, are they always going to give that to us? Or is there going to be like a time where we must figure out the frequency by ourselves?
Honestly, not in an exam, because what it would then require is that we give you 220 data points, expect you to organize them in intervals, and then count the frequency. Most of the time, what they actually give you is this table here. So they won't give you that. They'll give you this table, and they will give you the frequencies. So whatever it's in purple, they will actually give you, and then they'll ask you to do the cumulative frequency. Asking you to organize according to intervals, it would take too long in an exam. So if you go through past papers, you'll see that generally they give you those 2 columns and then they ask you to fill in cumulative frequency.
Okay.
Okay. Right, so guys, like I said, generally you're given the first two, the marks and the frequency or whatever your X value and your frequency is, and then you're asked to do the cumulative frequency. Hopefully we'll get there. Sometimes what we'll do, I'll just show you a quick screenshot, like snapshot now. Sometimes what we do is we give you some of the frequency, some of the cumulative frequency, and expect you to fill in the missing values. But we give you enough information that you can go and work it out quite easily. Okay, so let's fill in our cumulative frequency. We start with the first one because it's just 2, and then we start adding on. So 2 plus 6 is 8. Just write in the brackets. Then we've got 8 plus the next one, which is 11, so 19. Then we've got 19 plus 22, which is 39, is it? Can I not add? It's not, it's 41. Then we go 41 plus 39, which is 80. And you just keep adding and adding. Sorry, that's what we're looking for. And then remember the last one, when you add the 215 and the 5, you should get 220, which should match up with your total. Right, so cumulative frequency, you basically just keep adding the next frequency, next frequency, next frequency, and you get your cumulative frequency. Again, think back to what cumulative or accumulate means. You just keep getting more and more frequencies added on. Right, now that we have this though, we can go and draw an ogive. Now we are going to do that, but I'm going to need the starter next to my ogive in order to do that. So let's just move this. Okay, so we've got our data there. We're going to draw an ogive. Again, guys, we often give you, actually, we always give you graph paper. We never expect you really to draw a set of axes from scratch. It's not a bad thing to practice because I do think it's good for you to be able to draw an axis from scratch, but 90% of the time you get the axes given to you. Okay. Now, what you should have noticed from the first cumulative frequency graph that we had a look at is that cumulative frequency is always your Y, your intervals are your X. Okay, so if we just mark that for ourselves in our table, this is always your X value. The cumulative frequency is always your Y. So when labeling your axes, just remember that. This is going to be a real... Oh. I know it's not my neatest handwriting, but we're just rolling with it. Yeah. 3.C, I feel fine about it. Right, so there's our cumulative frequency on the Y. On the X-axis, remember, are the marks that we have. Again, we give you the set of axes. You don't need to draw it yourselves. I'm just going to fill in my values. I don't know why I didn't do this earlier, but anywho, here we are. Now, I've chosen to go up in tens because remember, when we are going to plot our points, our end points form the X coordinates that we're going to plot. So I am going up in tens in any case in terms of my X value. So it just makes sense to go up in tens on my X axis. In terms of Y, obviously a little trickier. I know I have to get up to 220 bare minimum. I can't remember. I think I went up in 30s. Can I not count? That's entirely possible. Maybe I went up in 20s. Oh, yeah. Otherwise, we're just going to go with this. 20, 140. Okay, so I went up in 20s. Right, so now that we've got that, like I said, we would give it to you, we can go and plot our coordinates. Remember, your coordinates are going to be the upper limit, so in this case 10, stupid thing. So 10 and then your frequency 2. This would be 20 and 8, 30 and 19, and so we would keep plotting. Okay, now remember when you plot this ogive, when you join the dots, it is not a straight line, you join it with a curve. So if you join this along with me and you've already got some of your points, when you do join them, remember it is with a curve. Okay, so my first pointers are 2, 10, 28, and so we keep plotting. I'm not going to keep saying the numbers in your heads. So your points should form some sort of shape like that. And now we join it. Now, obviously my screen is having a moment, but we're going to do our best. Now, remember this point, this ogive should always be grounded. It is grounded at the lower limit of your first interval, so 1 and 0. So we plot a point at 1, 0. We ground it on the x-axis, and now we join our dots. It's with a curve, it's not with a straight line, and you get an ogive that looks something like that. Okay. Try and don't sketch. So what I mean by sketch is don't do this with your line. I appreciate the artist in you wants to come out, but please don't. It needs to be a solid line. All right, and now that we've got our ogive, we can start to do a whole bunch of calculations using it. All right, now, because this is slightly long, take a screenshot of what we have so far, and then we will go ahead and look at our next couple questions. Okay, so I'm just going to chuck our ogive here so that we can work with it. Okay. Everything's going swimmingly. Right, good enough. So this is now where we need to start using our ogive in order to answer some questions. So the first question asks us to determine the IQR. Can someone just remind me what IQR is? Nice. Interquartile range. Can someone tell me how I calculate it? So how do you actually determine the interquartile range? Good. Q3 minus Q1. So that obviously means I need to know what Q3 is, and I need to know what Q1 is. We use our ogive to go and figure that out. Okay. Now remember, we had 220 values. Now, how you choose to do this, and I said this to you on Monday's lesson, I don't care. If you are comfortable being able to just go divide your data set up in quarters, figure out where the first quarter is, the third quarter is, that's fine. And like genuinely, it makes absolutely no difference to me how you choose to do this. I always find it easier to find my median or Q2 and then split each half of my data set in half. But again, I don't care. As long as it makes sense to you, you're good. So remember, we had 220 data points. So our median would be at the 110th data point. Okay, so what that means is at our 110th Y value, cumulative frequency, we would find our median. So if we go to directly between 100 and 120, we use a ruler and we draw a line and we hit our ogive. Okay, obviously it would be nice if I could draw a straight line. Let's maybe just try that out again. Straight line with a ruler. Come on. Okay. Straight line with your ruler to your ogive. Once it hits your ogive, you draw down. I will straighten it up, don't you stress. And you are able to read off where your median would fall. So this would be our median value, Q2, whatever you want. Okay. Now we know that in each half of our data set, we've got 110 data points, which now means that I can easily go and find Q1 and Q3. So Q1 would be half of 110, which is 55. And Q3 would be 110 plus 55, which is at the 165th position. So the 55th position, again, it's a bit of estimation. You're going to do the best you can, would be about there. Use your ruler, draw your straight line, drop down. So that would be at Q1. Q3, we said, would be at the 165th position. So about there, draw a line, and then we're going to drop it down. It's not going to do it, so I'm just going to do this. Okay, now once you have that, like I said, you're just reading off values. Okay, there we go. And this will be our Q3 value. My gosh, what absolute chaos. So remember, you have used the position. So you've read horizontally across and you're going down to get the value. So we are looking on the x-axis to determine those Q1 and Q3 values. Okay, so Q1 is about halfway between 40 and 50. There's always a little bit of leniency when it comes to this, guys, so don't stress. So I would say Q1 is at about 45%, because remember, these are marks. Q3 is just before 70. I would probably go 67. So Q3 is at 67%. And so our interquartile range is 67 minus 45. That's it. We don't have to do anything more than that. Gives us, remember, the spread of our middle 50% of our data set. So 67 minus 45 is something. 22. Don't know why I doubted myself. So there is a split, a spread of 22% in my middle 50% of my data. So whenever you are asked something to do with quartiles, you actually need to go and read it off your graph using what we already know about quartiles. In the last two questions I'm asking you for percentiles. Does anyone know what a percentile is? Don't overthink it. What is a percentile? What do percentiles do to your data set? What does the word percentile remind you of? What does it sound like? Okay, good. It sounds like percentage. Percentiles break your data set up into 100 groups. The first percentile, the second percentile, the third, the fourth, blah, 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 all the way up to 100. So percentiles break your data set up into groups. I don't know how many of you maybe have younger siblings, cousins, friends, whatever. Often when there's babies and kids involved in like medical things, they'll often say, oh, this baby is in like the 90th percentile for his age in terms of growth. So that's saying they're in the top 90% of growth measurements for that child's age. I don't know if you've ever heard that. It's the only one I can really think of that might be something that is within your context. But often when they talk about babies and their growth, if they're in like a high percentile, they're growing really well for the age. If they're in a low percentile, they're not getting enough nutrients, whatever the case may be. And so they're not growing as they should for their age. That's essentially what a percentile is. So when we've been asked to determine the 90th percentile, what we need to do is we need to figure out where the 90% would fall. So what position? So we want to work out 90% of 220. 90% of 220 gives us 198. So that is the 198th position will give us the 98th percentile. So we go to 198 on my cumulative frequency. That would be about there. We draw our line. There it is. Once we hit our ogive, we now go down. Again, with your ruler, drop it down. Oh, golly. Okay, drop it down. There we go. And this would be our 90th percentile. That's just before 80. I'm going to go with like 76. So the 90th percentile is 76%. What that means is 90% of students got 76% or less for this test, because remember 90% includes everyone below. We could then go on the flip side and say 10% of students got more than 76%. Right, and we would do the same thing for E. So we would want to determine where the 10th percentile is. So I'm going to give you 2 seconds to do that. So tell me what position the 10th percentile is, and then we would still go to our ogive and drop it down. Okay, so 2 seconds. Tell me where the 10th percentile is, what position it is at. Nice, Leila. Okay, I'm going to go with Leila. No one else give me anything. So 10%, this is actually a very easy calculation. You just move your decimal, is at the 22nd position. Okay, so remember I said to you on Monday, this is one of the reasons why I don't particularly like using formulas to work out quartiles and medians and stuff, is because a lot of you will just stop there. That's not what I'm asking you for. I'm asking you for the mark that indicates the 10th percentile. So yes, you found the position, but you now actually need to go and read it off. So 20 seconds is just above the 20, read across, drop down, nice straight line. So this will be our 10th percentile. It's just above 30. I'd probably say 32, 33. Again, remember there's always wiggle room because human error when you're drawing something. So this would be at about, I'd say 32%. So what this is saying is that 32% of students, no, it's not, it's saying 10% of students got 32% or less. On the flip side, 90% of students got more than 32%. So you can do it either way. That is what a percentile is telling you. All right, so I'm just going to hang here for a second, take a screenshot, and then we'll have a look at that example where I've given you some frequencies, some cumulative frequencies, and you need to go and work it out from there and then essentially use that information. Okay, but guys, what's really important is that you can read off your graph. I know it seems so silly because it's drawing a line and reading off a value, but I've just marked my grade 12 paper 2s. So many of them just could not draw a line and read off a quartile. It is the most basic of things that you need to do. Ruler, figure out where your quartile is, read it off. Do not stop at just the position. You need to still go get the value. All right, so please make sure you can use your ogive. Okay. So if we have a look at this one, a university student conducted a survey amongst his friends and relatives to determine the number of marketing calls that he or she received during a month. The data is summarized in the partially completed table below. Right, this is one that we like to give as well, not because it's tricky, but because we panic and we forget what cumulative frequency is. So let's just understand what the organization system has been here. The student has organized their people from their survey according to age, so 20 to 30, 30 to 40, etc., and then how many calls they received. So between the ages of 20 and 30, there were 7 people, 7 calls that they got. Between 30 and 40, 40 and 50, etc., etc. So the first question, as you can see down at the bottom here, says complete the frequency and cumulative frequency columns in the table above. So we need to use what we know cumulative frequency is to go and fill this in. Now remember, cumulative frequency is you adding up values from each frequency of your interval until you're at the end. The first value will always be the same because you've got nothing to add yet. But basically, we now need this frequency value over here. So the question you need to ask yourselves is, if you know that the cumulative frequency is 7, 7 plus what gives you 27, or plus 20. So if you add those two together, you get your cumulative frequency of 7. So we've got our first missing value, and that is the logic you now need to use. Then we've been given 25. So remember, we've got 27. We would now add the next frequency, and we would get our next cumulative frequency. 27 plus 25, 52. And we then move on to the next one. Next one, we've got the cumulative frequency. I need to figure out what I added to 52 to get 64. So what do I add to 52 to end up with 64? Who can tell me? Nice, guys. We add 12. That gives us 64. What do I add to 64 to get 72? 8. Nice. Okay, so get those last 2 values for me based on what we've just done. I want the last 2 values. Nice, Leila. Awami, nice. I want one more answer from one more person. So Leila and Awami, I see yours. One more person. I want to know your last 2 values. Nice, Kanisile. 76 and 4. Okay. Wonderful, guys. You can double check that everything's good. If you add up all your frequencies, remember you should get 80. We're going to go with that, it's right. But just remember you can double check yourself. Okie dokes. We then asked how many people participated in this survey. So what is the total number of people that participated in the survey? Who can tell me? Nice. So remember, I have just given it away, the last value for your cumulative frequency, and whatever the total of your frequency column is, that is your total. And so in this case, there were 80 people who participated in the survey. Right, the next one says write down the modal class. Now remember, we can't just determine the mode because I don't have data points here. I just know they fall in intervals. But I can say what the modal class is. Now listen to my question. How will you know that it is the modal class? What do you look out for to determine whether or not it is your modal class? So remember, mode is the most frequently occurring. So what do I look for to figure out my modal class? Nice, so one, the one with the highest frequency. My highest frequency in this case, and remember you're looking at frequency, is 25. So 40 to 50 is my modal class. Whoops, I'll wrote the right inequality. Okay, so modal class, you quite literally just look at the highest frequency. I'm going to show you now, once we've drawn the ogive, how you can determine modal class from an ogive, but let's draw that first. Okay, so, oh, I've really not done myself any justices here by not setting things up, but anywho, we will make it work. Don't know what I wanted to go up in here. I think it was 5s. That's good. Just remember, X is your whatever data you're looking at. So in this case, it would be our age. The cumulative frequency is your Y. I'm not going to attempt to write cumulative frequency up this Y axis. We are just going to roll with it. So my cumulative frequency has to go up to 80. I'm assuming I went up in 10s as well. Anything's possible when it comes to me. Oh, look at that. Okay. So we've got all of this, and we can now go draw our cumulative frequency. Let's bring our table down so that we actually have our information right here for us. And it's a touch smaller, if that's a bit excessive. Okay, obviously you would label your axes. I'm just being lazy and not doing that because clearly it takes me way too long. Right, so we draw our ogive. If you're doing it with me, just remember our starting point is the lower limit of our first interval at 0. So it'd be at 20, 0. We ground our ogive and then we start plotting. Remember, it's all your upper limits and the cumulative frequencies that correspond. So the first would be at 37, then at 40, 27, and so we keep going. Okay, so those are the dots you should have, and now we're going to draw in our curve. Hopefully my curve goes well. Okay, ogive. There we go. Alrighty, so obviously a much better curve than what I have going on here. The way you can figure out, and I said I would tell you how you could do this on your ogive. So if you were asked to find the modal interval, but you only had an ogive, your modal interval on an ogive or modal class is where there is the biggest distance between points. So here we can see that that is our biggest distance between points. So that is our modal class. If you read down, it's between 40 and 50. So the biggest gap that you have between your 2 points is where you will find your modal class for your data set. Okay, so we've drawn our ogive, and then the last question asks us, determine the percentage of marketing calls received by people older than 54 years. Okay, so we've been given an age, which means that we need to go to 54 on our x-axis. So 54 would be about here. And now what we need to do is exactly the same thing as what we were doing with our quartiles. We want to read up until we hit our graph. Obviously, you guys with a ruler, I'll straighten it now. Hit our graph, and then we read across. And wherever we hit, that will tell us the percentage, right? But let's get this. So if we read that off, that's probably, I would say, 67-ish. Okay, remember, there'll always be some leniency for you. We don't just talk nonsense. So that's 54, 67, cool. So we wanted to figure out how many people older than 54. So we want all of these people above that line. Yeah, 57, thanks, Awami. I was looking up the numbers now, I was like, it doesn't actually make much sense. So 57, indeed, thanks. So we want to figure out all of these people above, because it said older than 54. So we have got 80 people in total. We know that 57 and less were below the age of 54. So we want to figure out how many more. So we already know that 57 of them are below the age of 54. We want to know older than. So we would need to subtract the 2. And that gives us 23 people were older than. So remember, we want above 54. So we're looking at this portion of our graph. So that's why we subtracted the 2. And it said, what percentage of marketing calls, there's a lot of words here, determine the percentage of marketing calls received by people older than 54 years old. Yes. It's not gone well. Okay. I'm not going to try and fiddle here. But basically, we now know that there are 23 people who received marketing calls over the age of 54. If you wanted to go and figure out a percentage, guys, remember, you take 23 out of 80 and you times it by 100. Anytime you need a percentage, you take the value that you want, divided by the total, times 100. And because things are fighting with me, I'm just going to not fight back with them. Okay, but ogives, what we need to realize is that they are very, very helpful for us in terms of finding quartiles, so IQR, stuff like that, determining how many people above or below a certain point, percentiles, all of those things, they're very useful. Okay, so I'm going to let you take screenshots. Let's do this first, and then I'll scroll down. And then, guys, once you have your screenshots, your quiz will be on Google Classroom in the next minute. So please make sure you do it. Reminder to put in your marks, please. For term 1, it's literally just add a private comment. No one else can see it except for me. Okay, I'm moving down. Oops. Take your screenshot. And then once you have what you need, you're welcome to go. Good luck with your quiz. Good luck with any exams that you have coming up. And I will see you on Monday. Bye, all.